War II study group. I'd say that much of my military training has taken place since I became a member of this group. You have not always succeeded, but you have tried hard to fill in the gaps in my military experience. In order that you may understand why I say that, I was in high school during World War II, from 1942 to June of 1945 at East Nashville Senior High School. I'll tell a little side story. In 1944, in the spring, I was running for the president of the student body of East Nashville High School.
And got it.
Yeah, and was elected. I had a very effective spokesman who campaigned for me. His name was Clyde Lynn, brother of Troy Lynn of the Lynn Drugs out there in East Nashville on Shelby Street. Clyde was very active in the East Nashville High School ROTC. And then he had a military career after he left high school. I had been in the Army Reserve and in a command position in 1979, and I was assigned to go with some of my fellow officers to Germany. I went down in Frankfurt and met by a major who put me in a sedan, said, "I'm taking you from Frankfurt down to Heidelberg, which is the command headquarters of U.S. Army Europe. I want you to enjoy what you're going to do. You must have a friend in high places, because I'm directed to give you this invitation to the executive dining room on Tuesday. There will be 5 general officers there, and they expect you to tell them what's going on in the reserve program in Tennessee." So I got to my quarters in Heidelberg. One set of quarters over there named Patrick Henry Village, and the other set Mark Twain Village. So I might have been in the military and overseas, but it didn't sound like I was very far from home. On the bed was a note: "George, come around the corner and have a glass of wine with me and Jackie." Well, I knew who Jackie was. She was the president of cheerleaders when I was a senior at East High School. And it was signed Clyde Lynn, and the letterhead said, "Major General, Chief of Staff, U.S. Army Europe." So my driver was quite accurate that I had a friend in high places, and I did not even know he was there at the time I went over for that training mission. I grew up in Nashville. As I said, I was in high school during the war. And my experience militarily came along later. Graduating in June of '45, right after VE Day, and then entering Vanderbilt in the fall of '45, right after VJ Day. So right in between the ends of the war in Germany and in Japan, I finished high school and enrolled at Vanderbilt. At that time, there was a deferment from the draft for those of us that were in college. So I had that deferment for a period of time until I finished undergraduate and law school. The picture changed then, because Korea had occurred in the meantime. And many of our friends, many of my associates, were either being drafted or were volunteering and going into the military in a variety of assignments: Army, Navy, Air Force, and having that kind of experience. So my time came when I knew, because Korea was still underway, been underway for a couple of years when I finished law school in 1951. There was a risk of my being drafted. A good friend of mine, Jim Linebaugh, a fellow lawyer, said, "George, did you see in the newspaper last night they've got a recruiting program out. They want to recruit young lawyers who have graduated and passed the bar, because they need JAG officers. And if you apply for that, you can have a little special training and then immediately be commissioned as a JAG officer. In 1971, I had a branch transfer from JAG to MP, because the most active units in the reserve program in Tennessee were in the field of military law, not military law to military police. So I became an MP. Took a special course in the MP school from Fort McClellan, Alabama, what had been the chemical school and then became the MP school, and began to serve then, transferred from JAG to MP. In Nashville, a unit had been organized, a reserve unit, the 290th Military Police Brigade. It was in charge of units, military police units around the country. Tallahassee, Florida, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, Omaha, Nebraska, Livonia, Michigan, and Nashville. And what were those units? They were military police prisoner of war units. And their mission, if mobilized, would have been to run a camp of up to 12,000 prisoners of war. And my headquarters, the 290th Military Police Brigade headquarters, was their command and control headquarters. We had another mission, not a mobilization mission, of command and control of other Army Reserve units throughout Tennessee, a variety of units. National Guard had the combat type units. The reserve program had combat service support and support units, not those qualified for combat. So it was my experience then to work with those units. The Army Reserve organized those units primarily in the larger cities. A transportation unit in Kingsport, a MASH unit up in the Tri-Cities area there, engineers in Knoxville, garrison unit in Chattanooga, 1,000-bed Army Reserve Army Hospital in Memphis, and a strategic intelligence unit also in Memphis. These were examples of the types of units that were in the Army Reserve. And even though I was MP, our unit had the responsibility in the non-combat time and the not having been organized or mobilized to be the command and control headquarters for those units. I give you that bit of background to say to you, that's the reason I said why you have been completing my education. I'd have to say, if you ask me the question, can a person become a brigadier general without ever having had any combat experience? I have to say yes, because it applies to me. Then if you ask the question, should a person be qualified and promoted to that rank without combat experience, I'd have to argue with you sometime, and I'm not sure which side I'd want to take. Anyway, that's the background. All of us, of course, have been watching the news and celebrating the 70th anniversary of D-Day. I got out my copy of the Longest Day and watched that on the weekend. It's a great thing to watch because it tells the story fairly effectively, I believe. But when I went after having my course first in JAG, then in MP, then at the Command and General Staff School from Fort Leavenworth, then I was enrolled for a period of time in a special course at the Army War College in Carlisle Barracks. Went up there with General Carl Wallace, who was, of course, our state AG. And we were there for the Senior Reserve Commanders Conference and program for a period of time at the Army War College. By interesting coincidence, the week I arrived up there, they had a guest lecturer. His name was James Gavin, General Gavin. They assembled the entire faculty and student body of the Army War College in an auditorium there while General Gavin told the story of airborne troops in World War II. He told a fascinating story. And as soon as his 1 hour was over before the whole group, he went to the officers' club where he was surrounded by other officers, and for 2 more hours subjected himself to cross-examination and questions by the majors and lieutenant colonels who have a military career and were interested in knowing how he had gotten where he was and how it was achieved. General Gavin was an interesting personality, and it was my privilege to listen to the questions and the answers. And when they'd ask him a question about a certain tactic, and he would say, well, here's how Hannibal handled that in 200 BC. He was a scholar indeed. Born in Brooklyn, 1907. He was orphaned at age 2. Placed in an orphanage, soon adopted by a couple who were a coal mining family in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania. Although he was forced to quit school after the 8th grade to help support his family, he did engage in extensive reading, especially about military subjects. He might have been an orphan at age 2. He might have had only an 8th grade education up to that point. But at age 17, he ran away from home. He was in New York, Brooklyn, ran away, caught a train down to main New York City, joined the Army through a contrivance of questionable legality. A lawyer up there filed papers saying that he had adopted Gavin. It really wasn't true, but in any event, the Army accepted that. Gavin was only 17, but with the permission of that so-called adoptive father, he was permitted to join the Army, which he did. He was assigned as a crew member of a 155 millimeter gun in the U.S. Coast Guard initially, in that artillery. He was in Fort Sherman, Panama, described as on-the-job basic training. He became a voracious reader of military books and studied the tactics of Hannibal and other military leaders in the days of Julius Caesar. He was admitted to a very small school in the Canal Zone, enrolled in a 4-month main course there, under a personal tutor, a lieutenant. He studied 4 hours each morning, algebra, geometry, the required entrance examination to West Point. He graduated from West Point in 1929, was commissioned a second lieutenant. For 3 years thereafter, he was in the 25th Infantry Regiment near the U.S.-Mexican border. He then attended the infantry school at Fort Benning, while it was managed by Colonel George C. Marshall. He concentrated on developing his particular style of command. Successive assignments after that were to infantry regiments at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where he spent his free time reading because they had an excellent library at Fort Sill. He did it for 3 years. Went from there to the Philippines for 1.5 years, then to Vancouver Barracks in Washington, where he was promoted to captain, and then to West Point as a member of the tactics faculty, where he developed the special interest in airborne warfare and the utilization of parachute and glider troops. Concentrated course at the Airborne School in Fort Benning in the summer of 1941. Now we're getting down to close to World War II critical times. A condensed course at the Command and General Staff College in Port Leavenworth. He had then been promoted to be a major, went to the Army headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he worked to design the first U.S. Airborne Division. So he had a special interest in airborne activities from the beginning. The division in Louisiana was chosen for conversion to become the 82nd Airborne Division. With the 2 glider regiments, 1 parachute regiment, organic artillery, and other support units. In August of 1942, Gavin was named the commander of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and he was soon promoted thereafter to full colonel. He designed, personally led training missions. His instruction to his officers, he was often quoted. He said, "First out of the airplane door and last in the chow line." Those were his simple directions to his students and his troops. To the 82nd Airborne Division was judged ready for combat, and it was selected for the Allied invasion of Sicily, the island, of course, just down off of the Italian boot. That was to be accomplished in early 1943. Part of General Gavin. His book that I find most interesting, The On to Berlin, is familiar to many of you, subtitled Battles of an Airborne Commander, 1943 to 1946, is the book that General Gavin himself wrote. He calls it an odyssey from Casablanca to Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Holland, the Ardennes, and crossing the Elbe, and finally into Berlin. They have the significance of the title on organized glider clubs, and then the 1st Airborne Combat Division. So the Germans were ahead of us in that game, but he studied what the Germans had done in an effort to make it a part of our troops. U.S. began to experiment with its first parachute platoon in the summer of 1940. And by the summer of 1941, the U.S. had 3 battalions of paratroopers organized under a provisional parachute group, PPG. After completing parachute training in August of 1941, James Gavin joined the staff of that PPG and was given the task of designing and developing doctrine, training, equipment, and organization in the field of his special interest. The first U.S. battalion with a combat mission was the 2nd Battalion of the 503rd Infantry Regiment, moving from England to North Africa in November of 1942. From him, the world was at war in the early 1940s with impressive diplomatic and military opportunities. Germany provided good reason to doubt that the U.S. and Great Britain could successfully engage and destroy the German political and military forces. Then the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor focused attention for us on the Pacific and on the west coast of the United States. In early 1942, we were still seriously short of trained manpower, weapons, tanks, airplanes, warships. In 1941, James Gavin had been a member of the Department of Tactics at West Point, where he had developed a especially keen interest in the development of parachute/glider units. The 2nd Infantry Division was activated in April 1942 at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, under the command of Brigadier General Omar Bradley. Shortly after its activation as an infantry division, it was converted into an airborne division, with one of the infantry regiments being redesigned as glider-borne, 2 parachute regiments being added, and all heavy equipment being replaced by lighter substitutes for transport by glider and parachute. In July 1942, one of the parachute infantry regiments, the 505th, was activated at Fort Benning, with James Gavin assigned as its first commander. Now that's in July of 42, and he became the commander of that unit. He was assigned as its first commander. It was the 2nd Armored Division, commanded by General George Patton. In March of 1943, the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was moved to Fort Bragg, joining the 82nd Airborne Division. Late April or early May of 1943, the 82nd Airborne Division made the Atlantic crossing from Fort Bragg to North Africa, near Casablanca, under the command of General Matthew Ridgway, who Gavin that the 505th PIR would parachute into Sicily on July the 9th of 1943. Early in 1943, the Combined Chiefs of Staff opened and agreed upon a plan for the invasion of Sicily. Quoting on the part of his book about Sicily, the Allies in 1943 were about to undertake a major coalition campaign, the most difficult of all forms of warfare. An American Army commander by an American general was to fight side by side with a British Army commanded by a British general, with the overall campaign planned, administered, and managed by an Allied staff. This is the beginning of organization during World War II, of putting the British and Americans together. It was to be the crucible from which would come the tactics, the administrative methods, and procedures, and finally, and this is significant also, the personal relationships of the commanders and staff personnel. And it was, interestingly enough, that the generals from Eisenhower on down and all the senior staff learned their lessons, acquiring knowledge that they applied to the problems that confronted them later in the war, in which all too frequently the Allies would be confronted by superior German forces. The Allies had to be particularly skillful in using their inferior numbers in such a way as to maximize the troops and resources available. Inevitably, the solutions that they applied reflected the lessons they were about to learn in Sicily. And perhaps as I read and evaluate some of the writings about Sicily, Sicily was it was combat, but also it was a key part of the training, because here were the commanders and the personnel learning what to do under combat conditions. The story earlier about the deception that was practiced. In April of 1943, the British launched a dead body of a, quote, Major Martin, washed ashore in Spain. Attached, the attaché case they had sealed envelopes fictitiously addressed to British officials in Cairo, indicating possible attacks in Greece and Sardinia. A British naval attaché in Madrid requested that they be returned from the Spanish. And that was done after the Spanish had opened the envelopes and made photographs of all that they wanted to. Hitler was convinced that they were genuine, even after the landings in Sicily. Hitler sent Rommel to Greece to take command of the German forces there in response to that ruse. But Italians convinced the Germans to send 2 divisions to Sicily, 15th Panzer Grenadier Division and the Hermann Goering Division. Well, Sicily was invaded in July of 43. 505th Parachute Regimental Combat Team, that's with Gavin as its commander, then a full colonel, spearheaded the invasion of Sicily, and also participating with the division, a platoon of engineers, a parachute artillery, and within 2 days thereafter, the U.S. Infantry, 1st Infantry Division was established ashore. Also involved were the U.S. 7th Army under General Patton and Montgomery's veteran British 8th Army. Still, in 1943, still fairly early in the war, realized that what we were still planning and moving. The 82nd Airborne Division relieved the 3rd Infantry Division. On July the 18th, Patton organized a provisional corps with 2nd Armored Division personnel. It was new to battle. The 82nd Airborne Division, the 39th Regimental Combat Team from the U.S., 9th Infantry Division. All of these were put together by General Patton. By late July of 1942, 43, excuse me, Palermo had been occupied. Now the unit, the troops, the airborne troops that Gavin was a part of, were flown into Sicily by the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing. Messina was taken on August the 16th. And by mid-August, just a month and a half after our entry there, the battle for Sicily was essentially over. And the 82nd Airborne Division was returned to Africa to start its preparation for a campaign in Italy. America had learned how to cooperate in planning, equipping, launching a major amphibian assault. And that was very significant as the plans were made for invasion of Italy. Some of the most important lessons learned: how to organize and deliver airborne troops, how to move on objectives immediately after landing. And as said by Gavin, the first minutes in a parachute operation, when the paratroopers have the initiative, are important to both their survival and the capturing of their objective. The airborne experience in Sicily proved valuable to us in our later battles in helping train the green recruits, individuals and units coming from the United States. So Sicily was combat, but it was training ground where we were experimenting, trying things, and we found that they could work. One of the first things, the need for a Pathfinder units. That began to take place in Sicily and was carried forward into Italy. The basic plan that the Pathfinders would land about 20 minutes ahead of the main troops, get things ready, guide them in. The War Department observers in North Africa during the Sicilian operation were pessimistic about the establishment of an airborne division. That was still a questionable thing in the military. The problem was the badly scattered troops. However, excessive exercises that were carried on at that time continued in the continental United States involving the 11th Airborne Division. General Eisenhower himself had reservations about the Airborne Division. Were very supportive. So with the trial being undertaken, there was a division even at the highest ranks, with Eisenhower having some serious reservations. But Patton and Bradley were highly supportive of the use of airborne, both by parachute and by glider. The ones that supported it were especially noticed the number of German tanks that had been crippled in Sicily by the units that went in there. Maybe not destroyed, but crippled and put out of commission. In early planning for Normandy, General Bradley told Gavin, I will not make amphibious landings without being certain that parachute assault troops go in first. So the use of parachute assault troops at the beginning of a major operation, a land operation, was taking root. After Sicily, the 82nd Airborne Division returned to North Africa in August of '43. And under the command of Major General Matthew Ridgway, he was the commander at that time, began planning for the amphibious invasion of Italy in what was known as Operation Avalanche. Tough decisions still had to be made. The 5th Army was to invade at the Gulf of Salerno, then move northwest to Naples, and finally continue northward. The mission for the 82nd was to seize Nocera and Sarno, northern and further inland from Salerno. They would be transported in there by 318 transport planes and 318 gliders. That's a lot of support to get those troops on the ground. It was decided on August the 12th that the 82nd would attack further inland, destroy the river crossing of the Volturno River, hold those against advancing German troops from the north. In mid-November, General Ridgway told Gavin of the planned landings in Normandy. So while things that were happening in Italy, politically things were happening because, the Italians had kind of gotten at outs with the Germans. There was a question of how effective they were going to be and how loyal they were going to be. But in any event, it was intended that by the spring of 1944, the Germans would be in charge. The Italians might be helping us more than fighting against us. There would certainly be a large parachute and glider contingent when the time came for invasion on D-Day in Normandy. With a request from General Eisenhower, Gavin himself was sent to London to participate in the planning of Overlord. So at the same time that Ridgway was telling him that he'd be returned to the division to participate in the battle, he called that a most welcome assurance. He was the kind of man, kind of like Patton. Patton always wanted to be the commander. So it was with Gavin. Gavin was a planner and helped design the skills to take place in the Airborne units. But he still wanted to be the commander. So when Ridgway told him, go to London, meet with the folks up there, plan overlord, and you'll not only help plan, you'll be one of the commanders. Beginning of airborne units, whether the parachute units or the glider units, all under an airborne division. They were strongly supported, strongly organized by Gavin. Now, Gavin, just as the Italian campaign was coming to an end, was called in to be the commander of that airborne division and be promoted first time to being a colonel to a brigadier general. So General Gavin became General Gavin only as the Italian campaign was coming to an end. But he was then sent to London, and if you look at that movie that I watched again on the weekend of The Longest Day, you see that Gavin was an important part of the planning as well as for the execution. Whenever his units went out, he would be usually the first one in the parachute. He went with his troops, and he led his troops, and he had a strong feeling about the role that they should play. So I'd say, as one who has enjoyed reading about Gavin, the 2-year-old person who was without parents, an orphan, 8th grade education, but attending classes that he arranged every morning from 8 o'clock in the morning until noon on what we would regard as high school and college subjects, and then eventually serving as commander of regiments and eventually the Airborne Division. I give a lot of credit to General Gavin. It was an honor for me, just by chance, to be at the Army War College right at the time he came in as the lecturer and hear him give the lecture of what it was like to organize those airborne troops at the time. And then in questions from the students at the school to tell them how it was handled by the commanders in 200 BC. He was a remarkable individual, limited education, except what he taught himself. So we're much indebted, I think, to General Gavin, 82nd Airborne Division, and the things that they contributed.